The Player's Game. The rain fell softly against the windows of the art gallery on Fifth Avenue, creating delicate rivulets that distorted the city lights beyond. Inside, the space glowed with warm amber hues, walls adorned with paintings that seemed to whisper secrets to those brave enough to listen. Sophia stood before one of her own creations, a canvas of swirling blues and golds that depicted a figure emerging from darkness into light. Her reflection merged with the painting as she studied her work, unaware that someone had entered the gallery and was now studying her instead. Marcus had wandered in seeking shelter from the rain, not expecting to find anything of value in what appeared to be an obscure corner gallery. His Italian suit was impeccable, his dark eyes carrying that peculiar coldness that came from years of calculated charm and shallow conquests. He was a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, whether through wealth, influence, or the devastating effectiveness of his smile. At 34, he had transformed himself into a masterpiece of manipulation, each gesture refined, each word carefully measured to achieve maximum impact. But something in the way this woman stood before her painting made him pause. She wore paint-stained overalls over a simple white shirt, her dark hair twisted carelessly atop her head, several strands having escaped to frame her face. There was nothing polished about her, nothing designed for effect. Yet there was something magnetic about her genuine absorption in her own creation, as if the entire world had ceased to exist beyond that canvas. Marcus approached with his signature confidence, the predator recognizing vulnerability. He introduced himself with just enough warmth in his voice to seem human, just enough distance to seem intriguing. Sophia turned to face him, and he watched as her eyes, a striking combination of green and gold, assessed him with an openness that made his calculated approach feel almost cruel. Almost. He had learned long ago not to let conscience interfere with desire. Over the following weeks, Marcus deployed every tool in his arsenal. He appeared at the gallery precisely when she was working. He asked thoughtful questions about her art, questions he'd researched beforehand specifically to impress her. He sent her rare books about color theory and the psychology of artistic expression. He was attentive, mysterious, and utterly irresistible to a woman like Sophia, who had spent most of her life being overlooked and undervalued. Sophia had arrived in the city 2 years earlier, running from a failed marriage and a shattered sense of self. Her ex-husband had spent their entire relationship making her feel small, insignificant, telling her that her art was merely a hobby, that she should focus on more practical pursuits. When she finally gathered the courage to leave, she'd left with nothing but her paintings and a desperate need to prove to herself that she was capable of creating something meaningful. The gallery owner, Elena, had taken her under her wing, offering her wall space and encouragement in equal measure. Then Marcus had appeared, and with him came validation wrapped in expensive cologne and practiced charm. He made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced before. He attended her gallery openings, brought her flowers that cost more than her weekly earnings, and listened to her speak about her art with an intensity that seemed genuine. Most importantly, he made her believe that someone as accomplished and sophisticated as he was interested in someone like her. They began spending evenings together. He would take her to upscale restaurants where she felt out of place in her carefully chosen but obvious attempts at elegance. Yet he never made her feel inadequate. Instead, he seemed to find her earnestness endearing, and she interpreted his laughter as affection rather than superiority. She began planning her days around the possibility of seeing him, checking her phone obsessively for his messages, each one a small validation that she mattered. 3 months into their connection, Marcus had what he believed would be his ultimate conquest. He had orchestrated a weekend getaway to a luxury resort on the coast, a place where he'd taken several previous conquests. He'd specifically chosen it because the privacy allowed him to move between women without awkward encounters. Sophia, terrified and excited in equal measure, prepared herself for what she believed would be their relationship's natural progression. But in the hours before he was meant to pick her up, something shifted in Sophia's gut. It was a feeling she'd learned to trust during her escape from her marriage, that ancient female intuition that senses predation beneath charm. She found herself searching his name online more thoroughly, scrolling through social media profiles she hadn't seen before. What she discovered made her heart shatter in slow motion. There were other women. So many other women, tagged in photos at the same luxury resort, wearing the same stunned expression of adoration that Sophia recognized from her own reflection. There were comments on his posts, some recent, from women claiming inside jokes, making plans, expressing hurt. There was a pattern, methodical and cruel, of seduction followed by calculated discard. Sophia sat in her small apartment, surrounded by her paintings, and wept not just for herself, but for the version of herself she had briefly believed in. The version that Marcus had made her feel like. She was still crying when he arrived, flowers in hand, rehearsed affection in his expression. She didn't let him in. Instead, she opened the door just enough to speak, her voice steady despite the tears. She told him she knew about the others. She told him she recognized the playbook because she'd lived a version of it with her ex-husband, just expressed through different weapons. She told him that she forgave him, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to anger would be giving him more of her already depleted energy. Marcus's expression cycled through surprise, anger, and finally something that looked almost like shame. But Sophia didn't wait to see what he would say. She closed the door and returned to her paintings, determined to channel her pain into her art, into something that would outlast this moment of heartbreak. What she didn't know was that Marcus, for the first time in his carefully constructed life, remained standing outside that door long after she'd closed it. He stood in the hallway of her modest apartment building, flowers growing limp in his hand, and felt something crack open inside him, something he'd spent years entombing in ice and strategy. Her words echoed in his mind, not with accusation, but with a kind of weary recognition, as if she'd simply stated facts about the weather. For the first time, Marcus questioned the man he'd become. Not because he'd been caught or confronted with anger that might challenge him to defend himself, but because Sophia's quiet strength had revealed to him the emptiness of everything he'd cultivated. She had looked at him with disappointment, yes, but more painfully with pity. And in that pity he recognized the vast gulf between the man he was and the man he might have been, had he made different choices, had he chosen vulnerability over control, authenticity over performance. The flowers in his hand felt like an accusation. He turned to leave, already composing the next phase of his conquest strategy, yet something in him had fundamentally altered. That crack, no matter how small, would eventually widen into something he could not ignore. The Heart's Awakening. 6 months passed like seasons changing in fast motion. Marcus didn't reach out again, and Sophia had learned to live with the relief of his absence mixed with the peculiar ache of missing someone who had never truly existed. The man she'd fallen for was a carefully constructed fiction, a role he'd perfected through repetition. Yet the pain of his betrayal was entirely real, rooted in her own desperate need to believe in transformation. In the possibility of being chosen by someone so seemingly exceptional, she threw herself into her art with renewed ferocity. The gallery became her sanctuary, Elena her unexpected mentor and closest confidant. The older woman, who'd once been a painter herself before transitioning to gallery curation, recognized something in Sophia's post-heartbreak paintings that suggested evolution rather than regression. The colors grew richer, the compositions more complex. Her pain had become her palette, and from it, something genuinely beautiful was emerging. It was Elena who first noticed Marcus's return to the gallery. She mentioned it casually one afternoon as Sophia was preparing a new exhibition. That man who used to come by all the time, the one with the expensive suits. He was here this morning just standing in front of your paintings for nearly an hour. Didn't speak to anyone. Just looked. Sophia's first instinct was anger, sharp and immediate. Her second was curiosity, which she hated herself for. She didn't ask questions, didn't acknowledge the information beyond a slight stiffening of her shoulders. But over the next 2 weeks, she learned through Elena's casual observations that Marcus had become a regular fixture. He would appear mid-morning when Sophia typically wasn't there, stand before her paintings in silence, and leave. The paintings he studied most were the new ones, the ones created after their ending. They were raw depictions of transformation, a figure shedding layers like old skin, rising from abstract darkness into crystalline light, faces caught between rage and peace, bodies contorted in the process of becoming. They were paintings about survival, though Sophia had never explicitly stated this. Yet Marcus seemed to understand their language as if she'd spoken them directly to his heart. One afternoon, Sophia decided to break her own silence. She arrived at the gallery earlier than usual and positioned herself in the back room, watching through the open doorway as Marcus entered. He moved differently now, she noticed. The practiced grace had been replaced by something tentative, almost uncertain. He wore simple clothes, dark jeans and a gray sweater, and he looked as though he hadn't slept well in quite some time. She watched as he approached the largest painting, one she'd titled Fracture and Light. It depicted a woman whose body seemed to be simultaneously breaking apart and being reconstructed. Her face turned toward a source of illumination that came from within rather than without. It was arguably her most vulnerable work, the most honest representation of her own internal journey. Marcus reached up as if to touch the canvas, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. She heard him exhale, a sound caught between a sigh and something deeper. That's when Sophia stepped forward, her presence announcing itself before her voice did. "You can touch it if you want," she said quietly. "It's not going to break." Marcus turned as if she'd physically struck him. For a moment, they simply existed in the same space, breathing the same air, separated by 6 months of pain and growth and the slowly widening chasm of what they'd been to each other. His eyes, those calculating gray eyes that had once seemed so purposeful, now held something raw and unfamiliar. Confusion, regret, genuine feeling unmediated by strategy. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said finally, his voice rough. "I know," Sophia replied. "That's why I came." They talked for 3 hours that afternoon, standing in the gallery after Elena had tactfully excused herself to run errands. Marcus told her about the past 6 months, about how her words had haunted him in a way he wasn't equipped to handle. He described lying awake at night, running through the catalog of women he'd used and discarded, finally comprehending the weight of small cruelties accumulated. He spoke about his childhood, about a mother who'd shown him conditional love, about a father who'd valued image above humanity, about how he'd learned early that people were transactions rather than mysteries to be understood. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Instead, he articulated something harder. He acknowledged the specific harm he'd caused and admitted that no apology could undo it. He recognized that she owed him nothing, that his appearance at her gallery was not a claim on her time or energy, but simply an inability to stay away from the one place where truth had finally penetrated his carefully constructed walls. Sophia listened without interrupting, observing him with the same intensity she brought to her paintings. She was cataloging not his words, but the truth beneath them. She'd spent enough time with manipulation to recognize its absence. What she heard now was fumbling, imperfect, genuinely human vulnerability. It was far less polished than his previous persona, and somehow infinitely more beautiful for its imperfection. "I'm not here to restart what we had," she said when he'd finished. "That thing was built on your lies and my willingness to ignore warning signs because I was desperate to believe someone saw value in me." "I did see value in you," Marcus interrupted, then caught himself. "I mean, I do. I see it now." "No," Sophia said gently. "You see it now. Then you saw a mirror reflecting your own ego. You saw someone you could shape into validating your narrative. You didn't see me. You couldn't have because you were too busy performing the role of someone seeing me." The honesty of this assessment seemed to deflate something in him. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it without defensive protest. And in that acceptance, something shifted fundamentally in their dynamic. For the first time, they were meeting as equals, neither performing for the other. Over the following weeks, Marcus became a different kind of presence in her life. He continued to visit the gallery, but now he asked permission, checked in with Elena, learned to wait for Sophia rather than seek her out. When they did interact, the conversations were different. They discussed his work, his family, his dawning recognition that his entire adult life had been a performance. More importantly, they discussed hers. He asked genuine questions about her artistic process, her influences, her vision. He listened without planning his response, without calculating how to use information to his advantage. Sophia began to notice the genuine effort he was making to become someone different. He enrolled in therapy, something he mentioned almost shyly one afternoon. He'd reached out to several of the women from his past to apologize, a process that was humbling and often rejected, yet he persisted anyway. He started volunteering at a community center, teaching art classes to underprivileged youth, a choice that seemed to surprise even him. The turning point came on an evening when Marcus arrived at the gallery and found Sophia surrounded by rejection letters. She'd applied for a prestigious artist residency program, something that would have transformed her career, and they'd turned her down. She was sitting on the floor in the back room, surrounded by papers and the specific exhaustion that comes from having your work evaluated and found insufficient. Marcus sat down beside her without asking permission, and they sat in silence for a long time. Eventually, he spoke, and his words were not meant to fix or minimize. Instead, he simply acknowledged the weight she was carrying and stayed present with her in it. "I used to think that what mattered most was winning," he said softly. "Getting the best of everything, conquering the most desirable person, maintaining the appearance of success. But watching you, these past months, I've realized that what actually matters is continuing. Not the destination, but your commitment to the journey despite the rejections and the disappointments and the moments when you doubt yourself." Sophia looked at him, really looked at him, and what she saw was not the polished predator from before. She saw someone genuinely broken by the process of becoming real, someone who was learning to find value in effort rather than results. She saw, perhaps for the first time, the possibility of something authentic between them. "I'm not ready to forgive you completely," she said, and the honesty of it was gentle but firm. "I may never be ready, but I see that you're trying to become someone worth knowing. And maybe with time and continued effort and genuine change, I might get there." Marcus reached for her hand, and she let him, their fingers intertwining in the quiet gallery as evening light transformed everything into gold. It wasn't the passionate reunion of romance novels. It was something infinitely more valuable, the beginning of genuine connection built not on illusion but on the hard work of becoming real. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns resurfaced, conversations that required them to return to difficult truths. But slowly, across months that became a year, something genuinely beautiful emerged between them. It wasn't the intoxicating rush of attraction wrapped in deception. It was deeper, rooted in mutual understanding, built on the foundation of having seen each other at their worst and choosing to continue anyway. Sophia's paintings from this period reflected the change. They still held complexity and emotional depth, but they also contained light that didn't come from external sources. The figures in her work began to look less like they were surviving, and more like they were actually living, growing, becoming something new through the process of authentic connection. One evening, exactly 2 years after that first moment when Marcus had caught her standing before her painting in the gallery, he took her back to that same spot. She'd expected romance, perhaps an elaborate proposal, the kind of grand gesture he might have orchestrated in his previous life. Instead, he simply asked her a question. "Do you believe that people can change?" Sophia smiled, understanding that this wasn't really a question, but rather a request for affirmation. "I believe that transformation is possible when someone is willing to do the work," she said. "And I believe that sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the opportunity to witness someone choosing growth over comfort. Truth over performance. I love you," Marcus said then. And the words carried the weight of genuine feeling rather than strategic charm. "Not as the woman I wanted you to be, but as you actually are. In all your complexity and pain and tremendous strength." Sophia reached for him, and when she kissed him, it was with the certainty that comes from having seen someone's darkest aspects and choosing to love them anyway. Not because they'd erased those aspects, but because they'd confronted them and chosen differently. She had taught him the meaning of true love. Not through grand gestures or perfect moments, but through the patience of someone who refused to accept his performance and insisted, through her own unwavering authenticity, that he become real. In learning to love her genuinely, Marcus had finally learned to love himself. Not the constructed image, but the imperfect, struggling, genuinely human person beneath.